Welcome, everyone, to another CTC Software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis, the Director of BIM Development here at CTC Software, and today we're going to be talking about single sign-on, specifically how you can leverage single sign-on with your CTC Cloud Licensing in Hive, BIM Project Suite, SIM Project Suite. Basically, all of our suites now allow cloud licensing, and we're going to talk about how you can do single sign-on with that, depending on, of course, how your organization's set up. So, of course, as always, this is being recorded so that you can come back and refer to this whenever you want to as you're going through the process of setting up your single sign-on. And also, if you need to pass it to your IT team or anybody else in your user management side, you can certainly hand it to them. Same presentation, recorded, will be going into our YouTube channel pretty soon, i.e. probably tomorrow. Also, as always, we watch that questions window. So if you have questions while we're going through the topics today, I encourage you to type them in, and I'll try to answer them either in line or I save a fairly large section for Q&A at the end. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, our development team has long been working hard here to get you the single sign-on feature that you've been asking for. Many of you have been begging for this. We've been working hard to make sure we can implement it. And so here today, I want to demonstrate exactly how you can enable single sign-on for basically all the CTC tools within your firm. I'm going to go through the steps. Now, I'm not going to be doing this in a live presentation, so to speak, in, say, Azure Active Directory. But I'm obviously presenting live today, so that's what we're doing here. And so we want to make sure that you have all the information you need, all the tools at your fingertips to make sure that this is a successful implementation for you, so you can leverage single sign-on as you want to, as you need to. So we're going to be going through 4 specific topics today. We're going to be going over exactly what is SSO in case you're a little bit new to it and you don't really know what that is. I'm going to demonstrate a little bit how single sign-on changes the user login experience. It's very minimal, but I'm going to explain it anyway just so there's no questions about that. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the prerequisites that you want to have in place prior to enabling single sign-on at your organization. And finally, I'm going to go through the explicit steps, step by step, on exactly how to enable single sign-on. Normally, I would be doing a lot of this stuff live, but as I mentioned, this is more of a presentation style today, so I'm breaking from the tradition of what I typically would show, but I want to make sure that you have all the information at your fingertips. So this is going to turn into sort of a Cliff Notes version of how to do single sign-on at your org. So first of all, what is single sign-on for those of you who don't know what the term SSO or single sign-on means? I want to explain what this is for you. Basically, single sign-on is really an authentication method, except for I misspelled the word method. Glorious. It's a method that allows each user to use one set of login credentials no matter what application they're in, pretty much, so they can log into multiple apps using the same, for example, username and password or email and password. Many of us use a variation of single sign-on already. We use this when we sign up for multiple personal services, like we might use our Google credentials or our Facebook credentials when we're signing into something like Netflix or Spotify or whatever your other streaming services are. We can oftentimes group them together and use the same credentials. So if we change our password, say in Google, for our Gmail, then it also changes our password for all these other things, and it's fewer passwords to have to remember. It's fewer things to need to manage. It just makes our lives, the quality of life process, a lot easier. So that's what single sign-on is, commonly called out as SSO, single sign-on. So when you enable single sign-on at your company, there's a couple of things that are going to be changing for end users. Some of these changes are very minor, but I want you to be aware of them regardless. And so part of this end user changes, we want you to make sure that you have all the data so you can notify your users that their credentials will change. It'll still be the same email. Email address will be identical, but whatever password they used in the CTC side, the CTC suites or Hive, they may or may not have entered that same password into, or be using that same password for their Azure Active Directory or their Okta authentication. And so the next time they sign in to any of the CTC tools, Hive or the CTC suites, they are going to be required to log on. So that's a small change because they're going to have to sign in again once when you enable the single sign-on ability for your organization. And The important thing to notify them about is that their credentials that they'll be using will match exactly the same credentials that they use, for example, for the Microsoft Office products. So whatever they use to sign in to Outlook, that's the same credentials they're going to use when they sign in for the Hive or the CTC suites of tools. There is also a slight login user interface change, and I want to show you what that's going to look like right now so you have an exact idea of what the UI change is going to be. So today, when you go to sign in, you enter your email address and you click continue. When you do that, if you're not on single sign-on, as most of you on this call today are not, or in this session are not, you're going to go to the CTC password page where you enter your password and you continue. The slight difference that's going to change for them once single sign-on is enabled is it's the same thing. They go to that same login page and they put in their email, but then when they click continue, it brings them to whatever the authentication system is you use for your single sign-on. Typically, for most of the companies these days, it's Azure Active Directory, so it's going to look like a Microsoft login. They enter their password, they click sign in, and from there, the workflow is identical. But because we're being directed to the Microsoft page, it's going to be Microsoft's credentials. That's who the single sign-on tenant is for most companies. You may have a different one. We can talk about that. Absolutely, we can probably hook into pretty much any one that you're using at your firm. So, couple prerequisites. I want you to be aware of what you need to have done on your side before you ask us to hook up to single sign-on. The most important one is that all CTC suites that are installed, all CTC products, must be 2023.3 or newer. I say or newer because there are updates that come out all the time, but the 23.3 for all the suites is the minimum version that will fully across the board is known to support single sign-on. Okay, so that's the version we're going to ask if you're having any issues. Are you on .3 or not? IT needs to configure the link data that I'm going to show you in a minute. I'm actually going to show you exactly the steps IT will need to go through, and they need to copy some key pieces of information and send it to us so that we can associate your organization with our authentication, and that way there's a handshake and your users can leverage single sign-on. This is a one-time thing. Once that's done and they send it to us, we build the final link. That takes just a couple of minutes, and once that's done, you're on single sign-on 100%. So that's the process. It's install the 23.3 software from CTC or newer. IT creates the association one time, and we build the final link, and we're pretty much done. So I want to take you through what the steps are for IT to go through to configure single sign-on. There's a few steps. It's fairly easy. They've probably done it many times. And we have a little document that tells exactly the values that they need to use. We'll talk about that at the end of this session as well. But these are the exact steps. They need to create a new application registration. This is the Azure Active Directory steps. Specifically, it's only slightly different if you're using Okta or some of the other tenants, but the terminology is very similar. Application registration, we need to establish the authentication rules. We're going to build a client secret, define a token configuration. We're going to finalize some permissions, and then you send the required data to CTC. All told, for most companies, this is 5 minutes. It really takes 5 minutes. And for those of you who are going to be sending this presentation, the recording of this off to your IT, or if you are IT and you want to use this, I want to show you in the Azure Active Directory environment exactly what those steps look like. And we'll talk about some of the values. So for the application registration step, this is basically step one. When you're authenticated into Microsoft Azure Active Directory to the portal as a valid user who has the rights to do this, you're going to click on the Azure Active Directory service option. And from there, you're going to create or go to the application registrations from the side panel. When you're in app registrations, there's a little button there that lets you create a brand new registration. And from new registration, it's going to ask you for some key information, a name of the application that we're tying to. And for this one, we recommend CTC accounts. It's going to ask what kind of account types you need. In this case, we're going to be doing just a single tenant for your organization. There's going to be a redirect URI. That is technically optional according to Azure, but it's not optional for our service because it has to know exactly how to associate. It's a web-based link from exactly that path that's kind of right there right now. And then finally, you click register, and that builds the application registration within the Azure environment. Now, once that's done, we need to create some rules for how this authentication handshakes. For this one, and I'm sorry this one's a little more blurry just because it's a smaller screenshot here, but we click from the application creation. Since we're inside the application, we click on the little authentication option here. And from there, we're going to have one additional URI added, and that's the ctcsoftware.com main domain. That's also the front channel logout URL. There's a couple of checkboxes down below that need to be checked for token access and ID tokens. And then finally, there's some association there about which account types can actually register, and basically it's only accounts that are in your Azure account system. And finally, you click Save, and that's that step. Now, additionally, we're going to be creating a client secret so that the two companies know how to handshake back and forth. And this is the certification secrets. Now, this particular step here is one of the values that you're going to have to copy and keep so you can send to our team to create the actual link up here. So from certificates and secrets, you click New Client Secret. You give it a description. Again, we recommend CTC Accounts Secret, and you choose when it expires. This is the one thing that you will have to, or your IT will have to come back to periodically to refresh. That's just the name of the game with these security systems. You have to continue to choose to keep using that handshake. And so in the future, you'll want to have them refresh, and we may need a new client secret when that refresh happens. The longest time frame you can set it for is 24 months or 2 years. So you can make that choice and you click Add. And then once that's done, there's a little secret that shows up on that certificates and secrets page that you're going to want to copy. And it's important that you copy it now. I've found that sometimes when I come back to this step, I don't have the ability to copy it and the value is hidden. So you have to delete it and redo that step. So I recommend copying it now and pasting it into the final email that they'll be sending to us. Now, there's a couple more steps here, just minor things. There's a token configuration that determines what is used between the two organizations. And so you click to the token configuration, you add an optional claim. It's an ID type, token type. And then there's 4 values inside of here that we use to create a parallel between the accounts in your system and the accounts in our system. And then you click Add. Now, when you do this, there's also going to be the option to turn on Microsoft Graph, which is another portion of the Azure AD system. This is very specific to Azure, and we do want to add that. So you're going to check the box, click Add, and then once that's done, there's some final permissions that we're going to be setting here. With the API permissions, we're adding that permission for Graph to actually do something. And once that's added, you're going to delegate one specific checkbox. The other ones were already set, but we're adding in the open ID value there, and you click Add Permissions. So that's the steps. It is actually quite quick for IT to go through and just click the few options to generate this and enable this. Now, once that information is all gathered, you're going to be sending that information to CTC, to licenserequest@ctcsoftware.com. That's where you're going to send that. There are 3 pieces of information that we need, or our development team needs, to be able to create this association. One of them is that client secret that we copied back there in step 6F on the previous slide in this presentation. That needs to be pasted here into client secret. The other 2 pieces of information is the Azure domain, which typically aligns with your email extension. Whatever your so-and-so at such-and-such-a-company.com, whatever that happens to be, or at ctcsoftware.com, for example, for us, that's the email extension that you're going to be including there for the Azure domain. The final thing is the client ID. So we went through the exercise of creating a new application here, and there's an ID for that client. On the Overview tab in the CTC Accounts app registration, there is an application client ID that will populate there. You're going to want to copy that, paste that there, send those 3 pieces of information so we know what the client ID is, the secret for the actual client authentication, and then the Azure domain. And that's it. Once that's done, you are, and you've sent that to us, we create the final link, and your company is now single sign-on enabled. And any user from your domain, when they go to our tools and sign in, they will be able to leverage whatever their rights are assigned to them, and their authentication will be based on their single sign-on. Now, for those of you who are admins, I don't have a slide for this, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about this right now. For those of you who are admins of the organization, many of you may be using a tool like our Active Directory Sync tool. That's technically no longer necessary. You don't have to create accounts anymore, because as users go to sign into the tools, if they don't already have an account with your organization, when they authenticate and they go through this sign-in process, account or no account, it will let them into your org if they have a valid account in your Azure Active Directory or Okta environment. It's just going to let them in. It's going to create them. It's going to add them to the everyone group of users immediately. There's no need for you to do anything. Now, if there are additional groups that you want a user associated to, great. Go to the CTC portal, add them to those groups. You're good to go, but the user will be created. Also, if they are disabled in Azure Active Directory or Okta or whatever the tenant is, then they're not going to be able to authenticate. So there's no need for you to disable users either. So again, that Azure 8 or that Active Directory Sync tool that's currently in use in a number of your firms, not really all that necessary, because users get automatically created by our system with the SSO sign-up, and they are automatically disabled if they're disabled in the Azure AD system. So makes your management a whole lot easier when you're on SSO as well. So I'm probably going to do one final thank you here. Thank you all. We appreciate when you do show up live for these webinars. It's much more interesting when we get to answer some questions and understand more about the types of things perhaps we didn't cover that you want to know about. So in future sessions, we can make sure we cover that. If you want to be aware of any of the upcoming webinars, of course, ctcsoftware.com. On our website, there is an events page, and you can see all of the upcoming events. We have a lot of events for all of our suites. The BIM suites, the SIM suites, the Civil Information Modeling suites, the Hive product has ongoing manager and user training sessions. And so certainly sign up for those from our events page. And of course, as I mentioned before, this webinar was recorded, so you can come back to it later and have your IT use this as sort of a Cliff Notes version for how to enable single sign-on. An important note about that, for your IT, if they do want a document that steps them through with easy copyable values, then certainly email, once again, the license request at ctcsoftware.com, and that will get you access to that document if you request that when you're asking for more information about single sign-on. So with that, I want to thank you all, and we hope to see you on the next CTC webinar. Have a fantastic day.